What's up guys, Brian here in the lab with some gecko friends, and today in our video we're going to go over 7 lies you've been told about crested geckos. Now obviously not everything on this list is going to apply to everybody, not everybody gets the same information, but the way I went about getting the items for this list is this is a mixture of things that I've been told that I either know are wrong, either common misconceptions or just completely outlandish things that you tend to hear. A lot of this I got from reptile shows where you'll hear some crazy stuff from people that come up to your booth, as well as things from friends in the gecko industry, the gecko world that I've talked to and said, hey, what are some crazy things you've heard, lies you've been told about geckos? That's where I went about getting some of the things that I put on this list. So the first item on our list today is the lie that you cannot touch a crested gecko's tail or it will instantly fall off and they'll run away in fear. So clearly this one is just an over-exaggerated statement that has some truth to it. Crested gecko tails are fragile. They do drop their tails, defense mechanism if they're scared. However, the idea that their tails are so fragile that if you touch them or handle them at all, they will simply drop it and run away is just not true. You can even pick these guys up by their tail. And if you know how to read your geckos and your gecko's comfortable with you and it knows that you're not a threat, it's not an issue. I am very comfortable with these geckos. I know how to read their moods and how they feel. And these guys are comfortable right now. They're not scared. They don't feel threatened. So you can even hang them by your tail on your finger and they don't mind. They'll just sit there because they know they're not threatened. Their tail dropping is a defense mechanism against predators. If they don't see you as a predator and they're comfortable with you, they're not going to drop your tail. Now, big disclaimer, because I can already hear the comment section blowing up at me. Don't try this at home. This does not mean go home, grab your gecko by the tail and go, oh, look, he loves me. That's not how this works. I'm just trying to make the point that their tails are not that fragile like some people will make you believe. They're not going to drop just because you touch them. It's not that crazy, but still exercise caution. Still don't grab your gecko by the tail. Just don't be scared if you're handling it, if its tail's in your hand or if you touch its tail or something. Like, don't get crazy with being worried about their tails. But like I said, don't go grab them by the tail. That's just not smart. It doesn't help the geckos, doesn't help anybody. I'm just trying to prove a point that a lot of times this one myth gets blown up way out of proportion. So moving on to our second lie you may have been told about crested geckos, and that is the lie that they will not drink standing water. This is a very, very common one, and one that when I got into geckos a long time ago, I believed for a long time because it was just common knowledge that this was the truth, that you had to spray their cage and they would only drink water that was misted and they would lick it up off leaves or the side of the cage or something like that. If you think about it, it makes absolutely no sense because once you spray the cage, all those drops of water, well, they're just standing water. They're just little puddles of water. Why would they not seek out a big puddle of water in a water dish and drink that? It makes no sense, and it's absolutely true. Now, this lie is rooted in some truth that there are certain species of reptiles that will only drink moving water. They don't recognize still standing water. And for some reason, that kind of got attached to crested geckos and it morphed into this thing where they'll only drink when you spray their cage. It's crazy. It's just not true. They will drink standing water. If you give them a water dish, they absolutely will drink out of it. And as I've said in many videos in the past, the only real reason to spray a cage is humidity control. And here we control the humidity and the facility as a whole rather than by spraying each cage. So none of my geckos get their cages sprayed. They all drink standing water. Almost none of them get any sort of spraying or spritzing or anything with a spray bottle. So if this wasn't a lie, if this was true, basically all my geckos would be dead. And I promise you, I've got about 2,500 very not dead geckos who drink just fine out of a water dish. So don't believe this one. It's a total lie. Geckos will drink standing water. Lie number 3 on our list today is another one that's unfortunately common, and that is the lie that crested geckos get lonely or they need to be housed in groups in order to be healthy. This one is it's passed on anywhere from ignorance to just malicious action. I've seen it in both ways. Some people are just ignorant. They want to put their emotions onto the gecko and they figure, I get lonely, the gecko must get lonely, he wants a friend because I would want a friend, the gecko's my friend, I should get him a friend. That kind of thinking just doesn't apply to reptiles, to most reptiles anyways. These guys don't get lonely, they don't need a friend. Now it is true that if you have a couple geckos, ideally usually it's 2 females, and they get along, there's no aggression or cage bullying or food deprivation issues, and they get along well together, it's not detrimental to them to live together. You can certainly house multiple geckos together and it's not detrimental. I do it all the time. A lot of my breeders, almost all of my breeders, are housed together almost year round, and it's not detrimental. You just have to keep an eye on them to make sure no health issues arise, no bullying issues, stuff like that. But the idea that they get lonely and they need a friend, it's just not true. Moving on to number 4 in our list of 7 things you've been lied to about crested geckos, and that is the idea that breeding crested geckos is totally random and you've got absolutely no way of knowing what kind of offspring are going to pop out of any pairing. This just isn't true. Crested gecko genetics are predictable. Now, granted, there is a lot that we don't know about crested gecko genetics, and a lot of times you'll get an offspring that doesn't appear to be what you would expect from a pairing. Most of the time when somebody talks about that happening, it's an inexperienced breeder where that is an expected outcome of this breeding and they just don't know that. They're inexperienced. Sometimes there are things where we just don't know how some of their genetics works, and that's part of breeding crested geckos, but that does not mean that you can breed. There was an old adage that went around on Facebook forums like 5 years ago. It was really in vogue to say something ridiculous like, oh yeah, crested gecko breeding is like if you breed a Dalmatian to a Harlequin and then you hatch a banana. Like, that's just not a real thing. It's just trying to make the point that they're totally unpredictable, but that's not true. I'm not going to get real in-depth into this. If you check the link in the description below, I've got a whole video about explaining crested gecko genetics, what we do know, what we don't know, and going through all of it. I get really in-depth in that video, so check that out if you want to know more, but that's lie number 4. Now, number 5 on our list today, lie number 5 is one that I always get a good laugh out of every time I think about it. This is one that I had an attendee at a reptile show. I almost had a customer, but he certainly wasn't a customer of mine. An attendee at a reptile show in Kansas City. I drove out to Kansas City, I vended a show out there, and I had a guy, middle-aged guy, holding a couple shopping bags, come up, look at my geckos, see a female that didn't have a tail on my table, look at me, and with a dead serious face tell me, why is she so expensive? And I proceeded to go through the line of, well, she's, really nice, traits, this trait is rare, that trait, these, she's an adult female, bumps the price up, yada, 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 all the explanations on why the price was the price for this gecko. And he waited very patiently, listened to everything, and as soon as he started talking, I realized he was just baiting me in. And he looks at me and goes, but that's a scam, because everybody knows female crested geckos can't breed without their tail. And I was just like, what? This dude was completely serious too. He was dead serious, dead straight face, looked at me, and he stood there for about 5 minutes and argued with me that crested gecko females without a tail physically cannot breed. They are physically unable to reproduce and lay viable eggs without a tail. I think he was trying to argue it had something to do with breeding, that the male somehow couldn't physically, I don't know what this guy was trying to say. It was ridiculous, but he absolutely believed it. He thought it was true, and he was telling people this was true, and that I was scamming people selling female geckos with no tails and they were worthless because they couldn't breed. It was ridiculous. So that was one I had to throw in because I thought it was so ridiculous. It was hilarious. Lie number 5 that at least I've been told about crested geckos: they can't breed if they don't have a tail. Alright everyone, lie number 6, I went ahead and got this guy out of this display tank here to help me with this absolutely ridiculous lie. This is a newer one that I've heard going around in the past 2 years or so, and that is the idea that only a male lily white can produce more lily white offspring. That a female visual lily white will lay eggs, and all of those eggs will produce non-lily white offspring. This is ridiculous. It's just a basic codominant trait. Males can reproduce visual offspring. Females can reproduce visual offspring. The sex of the parent that has the gene makes no difference whatsoever. I don't know where this one got started, but I've heard it several times from several different people that they've heard it floating around, and people are spouting this as a true fact. It's an absolute lie. You do not have to have a male lily white to produce more lily whites. I expect that this probably came from a very shady, nefarious breeder who was trying to sell very high-priced males and justifying it by saying, well, you don't want to buy someone else's female. Don't you know that females can't produce more lily white offspring? You need to buy my very expensive male, and that will do it for you. It's just ridiculous. It's not true. Don't believe it if you do hear it. Either sex can produce visual lily white offspring. Well, thank you all so much for joining me today. We're down to the end of our list. Number 7 on the that was 8 fingers. Number 7 on the list of 7 lies you've been told about crested geckos. And this one, thankfully, isn't all that prevalent, but it is very important because if it's one that you believe, it can be very dangerous for your geckos. And that is the idea that they need high humidity levels all the time. A lot of people think because of these geckos, because of the way they look very exotic. So people think exotic generally to us means tropical. So people think they're a tropical species. They must want high humidity all the time, no matter what. And that's not true. They actually need a good up and down gradient flow of humidity levels to be as healthy as possible. So generally for most people that means spraying their cage once in the morning, once at night, or even just once a day if you live in a humid area, and that gets the humidity to spike, and then it slowly falls throughout the day, and then has another spike and slowly falls, and that up and down wave is what these geckos need. If they're high humidity all the time, it actually can interfere with their shedding. When it comes time for them to shed, they get kind of sticky. A really high humidity level when they need to shed makes their shed kind of sticky. They can't get it off, and that can lead to some pretty serious problems if it goes on for a long time. So do not keep humidity levels at a high level all the time. They need a good up and down, a good variety throughout the day. Even if it's real humid one day and not very humid the next day, that can work too. Another good way to solve this is to give them a humid hide. Give them a humid hide, and that will give them a humid place to go. So when they are going to shed, and they can sense when they need more humidity, they'll actually go bury themselves in the soil or the substrate in your humid hide. I got a good video on how to make a lay box for crested geckos. A lay box and a humid hide, basically the same thing. So check that video out. Throw one of those together and give it to your gecko. That gives them the ability to go to a more humid spot when they want to and need to. That's what they need. That will help them a lot. So that's lie number 7, our last one on the list today. Geckos do not need high humidity levels all the time. All right, guys, that is it. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope if you've been told one of these lies, you now know that's not true. I hope if you haven't heard these before and you do hear them in the future, you will know that's not true. 7 lies you've been told about crested geckos. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I'm Brian, altitudeexotics.com/AEGeckos on Facebook and Instagram. I really appreciate it. You all have a great day. I'll see you soon.